Hello everyone, we will be starting the Introduction to Swing series by first going over JFrame. JFrame is a class in the Swing framework that represents this window as you see here. This video will be an overview of the JFrame class in which I'll show you a general idea of what you can do with it. Without further ado, let's begin. First up, we'll be creating the JFrame object, and we can pass in a string as a parameter to give it its initial title for its header. In this case, it'll be example GUI. Next, we will give it an initial size using the setSize method, and it will take in two parameters, a width and a height value. In this case, we're going to make it 400 pixels by 400 pixels. Now let's see how our window looks so far, and to do that we will need to make its visibility true. So we call on the setVisible method and pass in true. So now let's launch the app. So here we can see the JFrame window where it shows the initial height and initial width of 400 pixels by 400 pixels. And then we also see the header having the text of our parameter that we passed in, which is example GUI. Let's close this for now, and I'll show you an alternative way to adding a title to the JFrame just in case you want to change it later on in the code. And to do that, we're going to call on the setTitle method and pass in a new string value. In this case, it'll say hello world. Now let's see what happens. Oh, that's odd. We closed the window, but it says the program is still running. We'll get to this in a bit, so let's just stop and then execute the app again. And as you can see here, the title changed from example GUI to hello world. Now you might be wondering when we would do something like this. So for an example, if you check out File Explorer, which itself is a GUI, you can see its header title changing depending on the folder that we're in. So it's good to know just in case you want to do it. Alright, let's close this for now. Alright, let's tackle the issue of why the program was still running even though we closed our JFrame window. So the reason why the program was still running even though we closed the JFrame window, because when we closed it, it was still technically running, it's just not visible. So to bypass this, we call on the setDefaultCloseOperation method and pass in jframe.exitOnClose. So we're going to run the program again. And this time when we press X on the JFrame window, the program itself should also terminate as well. So let's close it now. And then as you can see in the terminal, it says process finished with exit code 0. So this means the program has ended. And if we look at the top right again, we could start the program as if it was new. Alright, so another feature that you can do with JFrame is to prevent it from being resized. So right now, if we take a look at our GUI, we can just resize it as much as we want, like this. So let's say we don't want this to happen. So to do that, we call on the setResizable method and we pass in false in its parameter. So now let's take a look at it. So here, now we can't resize it if we wanted to. And also this maximize window button has been disabled, so we can't really change the size if we wanted to. Alright, so press X for now. And notice how every time we execute the program, the window appears at the top left. Well, what happens if we want it to appear in the center of the screen? So to center our JFrame so that it always appears in the center of the screen, we're going to call on the setLocationRelative2 method, and we're going to pass in null. And you got to make sure that you call on this after you set its size, or else it's not going to work well. And I'll show you guys what I mean in a bit. So first, if we run the app, let's see where it loads. And nice, so it loads in the center of the screen, so that's good. But what happens if we try to load it just before we set the size? And now let's just run it again. And yeah, so it's not centered anymore. So when we call on the setLocationRelative2 method, it considers the window size beforehand. And in this case, it didn't have any. So it calculated its size beforehand before we updated it. And because of that, it placed it where it should have been before the resize. So let's just close X for now. And let's move this method back to where it was. So alternatively, you could also pass in specific XY coordinates to make it appear anywhere on the screen. And to do this, we call on the setLocation method and we pass in an X and Y coordinates. In this case, it's going to be 40 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the left. So if we execute this code, it should appear around this area. or yeah, around here. So this is pretty useful if you don't like it being centered, you could just, make a special program that loads elsewhere. But for me, I like it when it just stays in the center. So as it is right now, it's kind of boring since there's really nothing happening. But with JFrame and how the Swing library works is you can add components. And we're going to be adding a button component. So first we're going to be instantiating a button object. And we pass in a string button, which basically is just text on top of the button. And we'll cover JButton later on in the series, so you don't really need to worry about it too much for now. And now we're going to add it to the window. And to do that, we need to call on the add method where we pass in the button as the parameter. And don't forget the semicolon. So now let's run the program again. Oh, that's odd. Why isn't the button showing up? So the reason why the button is not showing up is because we call on the setVisible method before we add the button to the window. And because of that, the JFrame loads the window before adding the button, so it only shows us everything before adding the button, which is nothing basically. So there's two ways to solve this. We could take this line of code and call it after adding the button. So let's just see how that looks. And yeah, so now we can see the button. But let's say you don't want to do that, and that's totally fine. Let's just move this back here. I'm just going to comment this line so it gets centered to the screen. So the other solution is to call on the repaint and revalidate method. So what the repaint method does is it tells Swing that the component needs to be redrawn, and in this case the component is the window, so it needs to basically refresh, right? It's refreshing the window, and by doing so it updates the button onto it. And revalidate method is used to update the layout of the container and its components, but I'll go over the layouts later in the series, so for now you don't have to worry about it. So this is just an alternative way of updating the frame with the new components after displaying it onto the screen with the setVisible method. So now let's take a look at it again. Nice, so now the button's here, and now we have something to click on. Alright, so here we learned that we could create a JFrame object and then, mess with the different properties and call on different methods to build our GUI. But what I like to do, and it helps organize the code a bit better, is to create a separate class for the JFrame. And here I just created another class called myClass, and it extends to JFrame. Alright, so for this step, we're going to be basically converting all of this code to make it work with our new class. So here, when we first instantiated the JFrame object, we passed in the string parameter for the initial title. In this case, since JFrame is the parent class, we can just call on the super method and then pass in the initial title of the header. And then for the rest of the code, we just basically, since we don't have the window variable anymore, and it's the class itself, and it belongs to the JFrame parent class, superclass, we can just call the methods directly. In this case, we're calling everything like we are here, but without the window reference. So to call on our new class, I'm just going to delete everything here. And then we're just going to instantiate our myClass object, and let's just run the program. Yeah, here it is. So it still works. And this is just my preferred way whenever I do projects like these. And I just like doing it because it just helps the organization. So it's just really preference. But I think it's pretty useful to do it like this. And this should be good enough to just understand the basics of JFrame. Alright, now it's quiz time. This is your chance to practice what you learned in this lesson. Question: which of these methods from the JFrame class is used to display the JFrame window? I'll give you 15 seconds to answer the question. Leave your answer in the comments or just say it out loud. Alright, time's up. The answer is A, setVisible, and then we pass in true in the parameter. If you got it right, leave a like. Next up in the series, we'll cover JLabel, which is basically adding text to our JFrame. So I'll see you guys then.